Step forward, step into the light. Welcome to New Europe Radio. I am your host, Ryan Falk, back from Thanksgiving dinner with my family, and I put off this show saying, I'll do it tomorrow, and then Thanksgiving came around, I'll do it when I get back, and now it is 3 in the morning on Friday morning, the day that the podcast is supposed to go up, and I have not done the podcast, so I am going to do it right now because I committed to a schedule, and I am going to do it. There's no reason it shouldn't be done, and so I am going to get it done right now. And I have some things to talk about, which based on two things that I think a lot of the people watching this have been seeing. The first are the white student unions. The white student unions are pretty good, although I have, I'll say what I'm going to say. I don't need to preface anything. The white student unions. What are the white students? What have the white student unions shown? They've shown a double standard, right? The double standard that exists against whites in the United States, and we know what the double standard is. The white student union shows the double standards in racial organizations, that blacks are allowed to organize exclusively black organizations such as fraternities, churches, business organizations, trade unions, whatever it is they want to do that is black, they can do. Whereas whites are not allowed to explicitly organize along racial lines. And so what whites have to do is they have to find ways to segregate softly. They have to find ways to softly segregate, right? Whereas blacks can hard segregate. Whites have to soft segregate. And moreover, when whites soft segregate, and that's pointed out, that's seen as a bad thing. Whereas when blacks hard segregate, it's not seen as a bad thing, except by a few really dumb a few of the particularly dumb kind of conservatives, which I'll talk about in a minute here. So there's not only a double standard in what is allowed, there's also a double standard in terms of how it is perceived. Right? Even if it's not illegal, though it usually is illegal to have explicitly white organizations, that is, it is still frowned upon. And also, I believe that there was a case on affirmative action which stated that it is regarding the 1965 Immigration Civil Rights Act, that it is legal to discriminate against whites. I believe a judge ruled, and it was upheld, that the spirit of the law is that these laws are meant to help blacks, not whites. And we also know that in terms of hiring policies. Now, the legality, I don't want to talk too much about the legality because I'm not a lawyer and I know the law is ridiculously stupid and too complex, at least too complex for me at the moment. I haven't read enough about the law. Don't want to comment too much about the law or what the law says. But anti-white hiring policies are more culturally accepted, okay? Law saying we're going to have a quota for blacks. I know you're white. I know you're more qualified, but we want to hire the black, right? Because diversity or whatever, right? So there's a double standard there. So there's also a lack of sympathy, okay, for whites and their problems. For white people having problems, there's a lack of sympathy for them. And this is, for example, in terms of people being shot by the cops, right? More whites are shot by the cops than blacks. But again, right? And so there's lack of sympathy. But of course, people will say, well, blacks proportionately are more shot by the cops, and so it means they're being targeted by the cops, and that's why there's a protest. That's why there's the double standard, right? Okay, and I'll get into that in a second. But I'm just saying, okay, but there is a double standard. You may think it's justified, okay. But there is the double standard, right? Another thing would be dispossession, okay? Nobody goes, oh, look, the Japanese population is falling because their birth rates are lower. That means Japan must be made a minority on the islands of Japan. That we need to push in a bunch of blacks from Africa. We need to push in a bunch of South Asians, a bunch of Indians into Japan, render Japanese a minority. Okay, nobody's saying that. Nobody is foisting that upon Japan. Nobody, says, "Oh, look, here's an issue. Here's a problem in some country over here. Send the refugees to Japan or send the refugees to China." Nobody does that. No, the only place, and moreover, nobody berates United Arab Emirates or Qatar or Saudi Arabia for not taking in any refugees. Now, perhaps you can say, well, those countries are smaller in terms of population. They actually couldn't sustain as many refugees as Germany. Point taken. But the fact is, they're taking in zero, right? Zero, literally zero. So proportionality doesn't even enter into it because they're not taking a single one. Okay, but where is the hate directed? The hate is directed against whites in the United States for not wanting to take in more. The hate is directed at British whites, French whites, right? It's directed at white people in various countries for not wanting to take in Syrians and give them a bunch of free stuff. Okay, so there is a double standard there as well. There's also a double standard regarding gaps. For example, Jews, and then below Jews, East Asians make more money than white people do. White Europeans, non-Jewish whites. If you want to say Jews are white, whatever. I mean, say Jews are white, say they're not white. Whether or not Jews are white is kind of an academic question. They're a different group, right? If you want to say they're still within the same race as Europeans, fine, whatever. But functionally, like in genetic, like in terms of like their genetic, if you want to say they're not distinct enough to be classified as a separate race genetically, fine. But they're certainly a different group in action, right? Operationally, they're a separate group, so we'll just say that. Anyway, so there's an income gap between East Asians and Europeans, but nobody goes, we need to close that gap. East Asians are making more money than Europeans. We need affirmative action programs to help whites catch up to the Asians. Right? Nobody says that. Nobody thinks that, see, the Asians, they're oppressing the whites somehow. Nobody, that doesn't even come into it. However, when blacks earn less than whites, and to a lesser extent, I'll just talk about blacks. Hispanics, there's more complicated. But with blacks, there's an income gap between blacks and whites. What's responsible for that? Right? For that, whites are blamed. So there's a double standard there. Now, a leftist listening to this, a leftist listening to all these things is going to go, yeah, there's a double standard, and there's a good reason why there's a double standard, because of the history, right? The history and the gap. So when I see, and so I cringe a lot when I see normies go on and talk about, like, go on and say, you're talking about the Native Americans and slavery and the genocide. Well, see, I'm an individual, and so, your arguments don't faze me because I'm an individual. I didn't do those things. Those things were long ago. I'm not tied to the sins of the father, blah, 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 blah. Now, first off, I don't, just on like, on a truth level, I don't think methodological individualism is true. But of course, what does that even mean? What does it mean for methodological individualism to be true or not true? That's okay. I'll just say what I mean here. You don't to come into existence. There are several years of your life that comes at the expense of someone else. Okay, so obviously you're not an individual in that sense. In terms of the economy, the life you have, it's based on a division of labor that you couldn't possibly sustain. It's based on laws which come from a state. Now, I actually want to be careful about this because I know like anarcho-capitalist arguments. Perhaps they're too small a group for me to be kind of tiptoeing around this. I mean, they loom a bit larger in my mind because I was one for a while, I guess. But but in practice, there's a state, and that's where your laws come from. Now, you may say, ideally, you don't need to have a monopoly in law to have laws. You can have sort of a polycentric legal order, and that can work. Okay, fine. Perhaps that's a possibility. But the reality now is that the laws come from a state, right, which is other people providing the law and order from a sort of top-down fashion, and you have to go along to get along. Even in a polycentric legal system, the law is going to be decided based on a series of agreements with lots of other people, and your economy, like your existence, comes from an economic context, and that economic context, for the most part, involves what other people are producing. You're just one sort of cog in that, and if you were producing on your own, like in a state of nature as a pure individual, you wouldn't amount to a hill of beans compared to what you can amount to with a big, complex economy, based on not only what other people around you are doing now, but their labor multiplied by the inventions of past generations, right? So basically, you're propelled by your ancestors and their past inventions of the past generations, and using a lot of the structures that they built layered on top of each other. Plus, you're benefiting from the division of labor that other people alive today are doing. So, and your existence comes from being born from two people in a family who then raise you for several years while you can't feed yourself. So so all that taken together, right? When you can fit that snapshot of what's going on all the way back through time up to you today, when you can fit that snapshot into your brain, the idea of individualism just seems quote unquote wrong. Again, what does wrong mean? Well, I think I explained why I think methodological individualism is wrong about as well as I can. I don't think there's any slam dunk, syllogistic proof, right? The libertarians love all their syllogisms, right? Take your syllogisms, shove them up your butt, okay? So I don't think individualism is true, but forget it, whatever. Say it's all true facts. The fact is that, and this is something that libertarians will argue about, is and something that they'll decry, is how the world, that people don't act in an individualistic way, even though individualism is so obviously true, right? They don't act in that way. They act in blocks, all sorts of blocks, in racial blocks, religious blocks, and ideological blocks, and I view ideological blocks and religious blocks as like the same thing, right? As idea groups. They block up, okay? And in practice, if you break it down further, they actually block up into ethno-religions. But that's a topic for another podcast. I'm not going to rehash that here. But basically, people don't act individualistically. They act in concert, okay? And so they don't act that way. It's not a natural way for humans to act or to think. And you even see it with, like, libertarians. Like, even libertarians eventually get to a point where they start to see the libertarians, they start to see things like, they speak in terms like my fellow libertarian, my fellow individualist, fellow individualist. So now you're starting, so even then, they have a certain collective identity forged on the basis of not having collective identity, right? That's how absurd it is, and that's how inescapable it is. So it just doesn't work in practice as well, right? Because if you say, oh, you're talking about slavery, genocide of the natives, stealing their land. It was their land, and it was stolen by the Europeans. They owned it, okay? Genocide of the natives, slavery of the blacks, Jim Crow, which kept them down, and institutional racism that today is keeping them down, right? All those things. And then you say, well, I don't, that doesn't apply to me because I'm because I'm just an individualist. I'm just me. I'm not the white race. I'm me. The problem with that is they're just going to say, oh, sure, but you still benefit from the white privilege. Like they'll say, and the thing is, they'll go, yeah, that's kind of cute. That's kind of cute that you imagine yourself to be an individual. I think that's wrong, but whatever. Pretend you're an individual or something. But you still benefit. But their argument is that you benefit from it because you're white. Okay, you're white. You benefit from white privilege. QED. So saying I'm an individual, saying that you're an individual doesn't enter into it, and that's why it doesn't work. That's why it's such weak sauce. And whenever I see people saying I'm an individual, hear me roar, I just cringe, and I'm just annoyed at it because I know it's not convincing anybody who's not already on their side, right? Because it doesn't understand what their argument is even saying. Okay, that's the thing. All right, so in order to deal with the double standard, and that's really what it all. When we talk about anti-white, like these people are being anti-white, they're always anti-white in terms of how they treat. You can't say they're anti-white if you just look at how they treat white people in a vacuum, right? Because if you look at how they treat white people in a vacuum, you could just say, oh, they're dicks or something. But no, but you say they're anti-white because you draw a distinction between how they treat other races, and you see that there's a double standard. That double standard, right, between these collective groups that functionally exist, right? Bye-bye individualism, so long and good riddance. They say that this double standard is justified because of historical oppression, which manifests in the gap. And so the gap and historical oppression sort of tie into each other, because the gap is caused by the historical oppression and is the evidence that the effects of the historical oppression are still with us, right? For example, the income gap between the blacks and the whites, why is that there? Why is there this gap? And so when these libertarians come in and say, and that's why just going over the history alone is not enough. Because some libertarians can say, well, I don't think blacks... And this is why I'm thinking about a particular person who kind of exemplifies... He's by far not the only person who is, but there's this user on YouTube that nobody listening to this will ever have heard of. Maybe one or two people have heard of this little turd. There's a guy named Eagle Eye. I don't even know why I'm saying his username. It doesn't matter. He doesn't matter. But the thing is, what he represents matters. That he'll say that biological differences between the races and intelligence doesn't exist, and white privilege doesn't exist. Okay, and so, but they don't get it, because it's like, okay, so you're saying that blacks and whites are the same in the brain, right? This this cosmic joke, like, oh look, blacks and whites, they differ in height, they differ in in the relative shape and size of the heart and the heart chambers. They differ in the cartilage in the nose, in the ears, in the relative sizes of the limbs and length of the limbs, the distributions of fast twitch, fastest twitch, and slow twitch muscle fibers. They differ in the distribution of the muscle fibers relative to the trunk, the upper leg, and the lower leg. Blacks have that teardrop, calf because they don't have that. They don't have as much muscle in their lower leg relative to their upper leg. And so you have all these differences in skeletal structure, right? Oh, but so aside from the cosmic joke of a coincidence that equality would be, how absurd that has to be for that to happen, they're just not aware. And I'm starting to think that the reason that these people aren't leftists, these kind of libertarians who say, oh, the races are genetically the same in the brain, and there's no white privilege, the reason that they're not leftists is because they're just kind of stupid. Because if they were a little bit smarter, what they would go, see, yeah, the races, they're the same in the brain, but there's no white privilege. But wait a minute, why then is there this income gap? Huh, right? And they would think about it for a second and go, well, if we're going to rule out genetics because that's, evil, racist, KKK, Nazi, scientific racism. That's, cross that out before it even enters. If that can't be true, right, we're just pushing that off the table. That can't be true. Well, what does that leave? Well, it leaves two things. It leaves what Thomas Sowell likes to say, which is internal black culture. Okay, there's that. And some of them gravitate to that. You get some dumb libertarians who deny genetics as racist, say, Thomas Sowell, internal culture explanation. Right? Or they go, full-on white privilege. Right? So there's that. And that's why the gap, like the current gap, and the gap, like the one thing I point out the most is like income, because that's a solid number. Another thing you can look at is incarceration rates. Why is there a racial difference in incarceration rates? Must be that the police are targeting blacks. That's institutional racism, right? Why is there the difference in wealth? Why is there the difference in access to health care? Why are there differences in ability to swim? I mean, that's one thing I've heard. Is like blacks can't swim as much. They lack access to swimming education and swimming pools or something. So you have all of these gaps, and these gaps tie into the history, because the existence of the gaps validates the history, and the history is a plausible explanation for what causes the gap. And so they both feed into each other, and they then justify the double standard. Now, there are ways to go into these things, and we're going over history, and that's something I'm going to talk about in this podcast. But before I go into this podcast, just talking about these things in isolation doesn't work, because, like, here's what happens. Let's say someone says that, let's say someone says, "Oh, Africa is shitty because of colonialism," and I did what I think was a good article on that, talking about colonialism and saying, "Look, here's how poor Africa was before colonialism. Here's how they were during. Here's how they were after. Look, doesn't look like colonialism had an effect. If anything, it looks slightly positive. Here's how African countries post-colonialism fared relative to Asian countries, which had similar, per capita GDPs at the time in 1960. And look, they shot ahead, but the African countries remained poor, right? And you can say, oh, well, see, that's the legacy of colonialism causing structural damage not reflected in the GDP numbers, right? But the hell of it is that nobody at the time was saying that. Okay, this is something that this is something that is said afterwards. It's something that people made up to sort of explain why the gaps didn't go away. It reminds me sort of how when the Civil Rights Act was passed, people were thinking, oh, in 2 generations, about 40 years, we're going to have proportionate racial proportionality, without any need for affirmative action. We'll need some affirmative action at first. But in 40 years, we won't even need any affirmative action. We'll have racial proportionality in doctors, in lawyers, in research scientists, and all the smart people jobs. We'll have racial proportionality just because we're going to equalize the opportunity. Or maybe not necessarily racial proportionality, because we'll reduce a lot of the inequalities in terms of school quality, for example. But they won't go away entirely. But it'll be enough. Like 80% of the difference will be eliminated, and so 80% of life outcomes will go away within 20 or 30 years, and then the remaining 20% will slowly crumble away over a longer period of time. You'll reach sort of a knee in the curve, and then blacks will massively close the gap, and then there'll be like a kind of a remainder, and they'll sort of drift towards it a little bit more from that point. That was sort of the prediction in 1965. Obviously, that hasn't happened. The black-white income gap has increased from what it was in 1972. And then there are some people saying, there are some people even saying that Okay, there are some people saying that because between 1965 and 1972, nationally the black-white income gap decreased. The problem with that, though, is that first off, it was decreasing before the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Right? It was decreasing before then. So what that sort of tells me is that perhaps the Civil Rights Act was an effect, not a cause of a decreasing income gap. But it also calls into question, well, wait a minute. If the decreasing of the black-white income gap started before the Civil Rights Act, that means it was occurring under segregation, which sort of calls into question how bad was segregation really in terms of income. Okay. But another thing is that once you control for the relative economic rise of the South, thanks to air conditioning, that is it's entirely eaten up. Right? There was no narrowing from 1956 to 1972. Once you control for the economic rise of the former Confederate states, which blacks which are disproportionately black compared to the rest of the country. So I forget what I was talking about. I lost my train of thought here. Oh yeah, but if you talk about these things and you drop a lot of hate facts, sometimes it'll work. It depends on the person, but the problem is, if you want to do something comprehensive, or if you want to do something that's really like blood in the face, like questioning the lynching myth, or questioning how bad slavery really was, that's a really hard nut. And so, and the harder you do, or the more things you do, the more that they're going to tend towards the high tower. Now, the high tower exists in the universities, not any university that like a leftist has gone to. Okay, because the leftists, they will go to universities, and what they find is they find also professors that are profoundly fallible, that they are biased, that they make basic mistakes, and they're biased in like systematic ways. It's not like one-off things, right? So that's what they find in reality when they go to these universities, right? But in the back of their mind, there's sort of an ideal. There's sort of an ideal professoriate in the high tower that deals with literally every connection, every possible problem with every theory. Like, this has all been done to a degree that you cannot fathom. It is unfathomable in its omniscience. Not omnipotence, but omniscience. Now, omniscience, in Latin, all-knowing, don't take that too literally. Like, it's really just knows a hell of a lot more than you mere mortal, ever can. Evidence of that, of course, is the jargon, and there's all the trappings of authority and all that stuff. And if you listen to my previous posts and agreed with my previous posts on ethno-religion, this thing about the universe, like, it then becomes clear, like, well, is there like an analog for a church? And I think obviously there is, was the university, which makes sense because universities actually originated as the cathedral schools and became universities later. That's a story for another time, when they became a university. And the split between the social sciences and the hard sciences goes way back. It goes way back to when there was when you had theology on the one side, and on the other side you had medicine, law, and philosophy on the other. And of course, philosophy referred to things like alchemy, referred to things like physics. So there's this, but anyway, so there's this authority, there's this high tower, and when you start dropping, especially a large number of hate facts, and especially if you're doing something that is that basically is a comprehensive challenge. Okay, it's one thing to say, "Oh no, you're actually wrong about the slave trade." Oh, did you know whites were enslaved by the Barbary pirates? I mean, you can, if you just do one thing, like they may listen and go, "Oh, okay, whatever." But if you start really piling on, right, historical revision after historical revision, hate fact after hate fact, they're going to mentally retreat into a belief in magic science man. And what they do is they go, well, I personally myself right here cannot respond to what you're saying. I can't respond to it. However, I know that somewhere else, there's this magic science man, and if he were here, he could put you in your place. He could eviscerate everything that you're saying, and that would be the end of it, right? So there's sort of an authority there. So there is the gap, right? And justified by history. Well, anyway, there is a gap which is explained by a history of oppression, and the gap itself is the evidence of the history of oppression. And this is made more plausible by the belief that all this stuff has been meticulously outlined and thoroughly backed up by, authorities, by people who really, really know what they're doing in a way that normal people just can't. Okay, and so that's why it's important to break down that authority, so that they don't have magic science man. You're not doing it to say, look, your authorities are crap. Don't believe anything that they're going to say, right? No, it's just to clear out their priests, clear out their saints, just move them away, so that you can then argue on the level. Because before you do that, they imagine that there's some special esoteric knowledge somewhere else. Basically, all I have to do is dissuade them of that esoteric knowledge, not because that's then they're going to accept everything that you say, although they're more likely to from that point. Just sort of, well, basically, when you convince somebody of one thing, they're more likely to listen to you on other topics. But aside from that effect, basically what you're doing is you're just, saying, get your authorities out of here, so that I can actually argue, so that I can actually make arguments, on like an idea-based level, as opposed to having to deal with whatever it is you think historical consensus is, which may not even be the real historical. That's another thing, is that a lot of these leftists imagine that scientific consensus is more on their side than it really is. But so how do you go into the authority? Well, there's a few things, and I actually did a video a while ago on peer review, and in that video I was focused mainly on peer review, and one thing I talked about was replication, about how under half of studies in medicine and psychology can be replicated. That's if there's even proper materials to do a replication. Another issue is that half of all studies don't even provide the materials to do so. SciGen papers, which is basically a computerized algorithm that produces gobbledygook and puts it has a buzzword spinner and a text spinner to say the synergistic connectivity of the fourth blah, 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 right? Essays like that. Those have been able to get into the big journals, into like Springer and Elsevier and Wolters Kluwer journals. Okay, and also there's also examples of individuals making deliberately bad papers from fake universities even, and getting those into lots of journals. Anyway, I'll just link that video. But there's also another thing you can look at regarding the authorities is the high scores, right? Is that there's certain individuals, I believe there's some Japanese female who was able to fake over 300 papers, right? Was able to fake over 300 papers. Maybe it was a guy, but I think that's the high score. But there's certainly multiple instances of people with over 100 fake papers, and that's impressive. That's, on the one hand, it's you got to give them props for being able to get that many fake papers in. But I think it's not just their tenacity to do that, but also the sort of a dereliction on the part of the journals, that they can't screen these or spot the errors sooner. Because typically these researchers will submit multiple papers, kind of on a theme, and if what they're saying is fake, within about 5 or 6 papers, it should be kind of clear that they're making shit up if the reviewers are looking closely. But if you cycle peer reviewers, you have different people reviewing each paper individually. They may not spot the inconsistencies across the multiple papers or something like that. So I think that's largely responsible for why you get these high scores. So there's the high scores. Also, you can there's several historical examples of scientists being bellicose and dogmatic in their wrong beliefs. Like having a roast on the idea of ulcers being caused by viruses. The story of Semmelweis. There's lots of things like that. You can also talk about statistical prediction rules and how experts do know better than statistical prediction rules. And another thing that I would like to find, and if anyone is listening to this podcast, what I would request is examples of big things in university subjects that are just fake, or were very, or the more recent the better, if they're not practiced today. Fake things that are in the university. One thing I think is fake is the practice not of psychiatry as a field as a whole, but psychotherapy. A lot of people will attack psychiatry and I have to be careful doing this, because a lot of the people that attack psychiatry are dumb. They're dum-dums. And also they attack psychiatry for dumb reason. One thing they'll say, lobotomies were like cruel and turned people into zombies. Well, it turned murderers into happy zombies. So, who didn't murder people? So, lobotomies were good, and electroshock therapy, the health, they had health and safety protocols, and they improved upon it over time. A lot of the horror stories involved the early use of shock therapy. Later on, it got safer, and it actually worked and actually cleared up issues. It cleared up schizophrenia and stuff. So shock therapy was okay. Lobotomies were okay. The thing that I have an issue with within psychiatry is this idea of psychotherapy, because there have been studies that compare the effectiveness of psychotherapy to just taking a layman with no training and have him just counsel somebody. Just listen to their problems and give their own personal advice to how to deal with their problems, and they do about the same. So, but the thing is, there's a whole field, or at least for a while there was a whole field on psychotherapy, and studies show that it's basically kind of a crock field. So there are lots of little things to help sort of break down the authorities. Oh, and in the comment section, if you can think of anything like that, a fake field in its entirety. Now, one thing you could say, well, here's an example of a field that is fake, comprehensively fake from top to bottom. Feminist theory, right? Somebody gets a degree in feminist or women's studies, whatever it's called, or critical race theory, right? You could say that is a field that is from top to bottom fake. Now, there are some normie people who already believe that. And if you got some normies who are citing something from the stems to say that you're wrong about what you're saying about race, you could say, well, look at feminist theory, look at critical race theory, that exists. One thing that they're going to do is they're going to go, well, stems are different, right? Because there seems to be in the public. Now, I haven't seen any polls on this. This is just sort of my opinion. But there seems to be emerging a distinction between STEM and non-STEM. And a belief that STEM fields are rigorous and non-STEM is just kind of made up. But that's only an issue when you're talking to normies about this. That's only an issue when you're talking about the gap. Like normies who will deny race and say that biologists... the majority of biologists believe race doesn't exist or something like that, which is not true, but whatever. They'll say something like that, and so the authority actually holds for that. But regarding these historical episodes, you're on a little bit of a better ground for rejecting authority there, because what is history? Because first off, history is a soft science, and there's no methodology, there's no experiment, there's no replication. Like, how do you, like, what were the effects of slavery? I don't know. Let's run an experiment. What? What is that? What would that even mean? There's no experimentation, and so the whole scientific method doesn't really enter into it, except for like a few things. Like somebody can make a claim, that like they can make scientific claims about what happened at a battle, right? And you can use scientific methods to figure out if that's even possible, what the likelihood of that was, right? So there's stuff like that, but usually not. Usually you have to go with like records, you have to go with inferences to try to say what was the population of the Native Americans in this region, 500 years ago. You could go, well, I don't know. How many canoes were there per person? And if we say, well, they're about, each family had its own canoe. What was the average family size? Well, this explorer said the average family size was 6. Okay, how many canoes were there? Well, we counted 300. Okay. Do we have any idea how many there were before? Well, so you do things like that to sort of estimate a population size. So that's kind of scientific, but it's not. It's scientific-y. It's sort of scientific. And of course, to Latinize it, you would say it is pseudoscientific. But that doesn't mean it's bad. That doesn't mean don't do it. All right. The term pseudoscience, unfortunately, has come to be colloquially used as a synonym for crackpottery and quackery and just false science. When really history, there's all sorts of sort of science in history. Okay. And it's not pseudoscience in the colloquial pejorative sense. It's pseudoscience in that it is kind of science, but not fully can't be replicated, can't really be falsified. It's kind of a gray area between science and just sort of winging it, just sort of making stuff up. And so I've been taking a long time to get to this. And so I've been looking at these white student unions. And on the one hand, it's always exciting to see white power getting buzz, and getting people attacking it. And this is a much better thing than White Man March. Remember White Man March and what that was supposed to be? That was pretty funny. But it seems to be getting buzz, and it's doing some good in that it's highlighting it. So normie whites will see, oh, look at how vicious they are against the white student unions. Now, if they've been, if they've had the proper political training at their universities, then what they're going to go say, oh yes, it's a double standard, but the double standard is justified because of historical oppression. And at best, they'll think that these white student unions are just kind of stupid. They're just filled with stupid whites who don't know why there is a double standard, right? They'll go, because at the very lowest level, there's people who go, hey, there's a double standard between the races, that's not fair. That's the lowest level. One level above that is people who go, yes, there's a double standard, and that's because of history, right? Look at the gap, right? And then a level above that is basically, in terms of complexity, in terms of time and effort and depth gone into this is like 10 tiers above that level, is basically going, no, the history is all fake, and it's like a pageant. Their view of history is like a pageant. It's very one-dimensional. So history is all fake, and the gap is caused by genetic differences between the races. That's super high level. That's a level above that. But the dumbest ones are the people who point out a double standard, recognize a double standard, but don't realize that the double standard is or said to have been a result of some sort of historical oppression, and that's why, or said to be justified by historical oppression. So I see these white student union groups go out, like their effect is going to be kind of limited, right? At most, what it's going to do is it's going to activate. Basically, it's going to and this is just me thinking. This is my opinion. I think it's just sort of going to activate some of the dumber right-wing white people. That's what it's going to do. It's just going to activate some of the dumb ones, and it's. And I also look at that, and I also sort of see, oh, I wish I had my book ready when these white student unions were at their highest buzz, at their peak buzz, so I could somehow try to convince all these people doing the white student unions, hey, promote my book, promote my mixtape, or something like that. But that's what you get for taking forever to do something. You miss opportunities. Boats pass you by when you're faffing about and not getting it done. So that's kind of my fault there. But another thing, I sort of look at the Right Stuff strategy, and they do things like this all the time. They do all sorts of trolling events, and that's good and that's irreverent. But the problem is if you don't get into what's going on here, and when you break it down like this, you break it down that there's double standards, and that's what anti-white means. Right, in practice, if you really think about all the anti-white stuff that they're doing, why is it anti-white? Oh, because they're treating whites worse than they treat other races. Right? People who are anti-white do this. Right? It's a double standard, and the double standard is justified by the history and the gap, which tie into each other. So, in order to deal with this double standard, i.e., anti-whiteness, you have to deal with the history and the gap. But before you can deal with history and the gap, you have to go after the authorities. Because if you start going after the history and the gap, like really hardcore, you start attacking the lynching myth, attacking the myth of the Ku Klux Klan, attacking pointing out what the slave trade was, pointing out how the slave trade probably didn't increase the number of blacks who were ultimately enslaved, how the Atlantic slave trade did not, how more blacks were actually enslaved within Africa. Okay, talk about the Arab slave trade, talk about how slavery in the U.S. was pretty nice and blacks had it pretty good compared to how everyone else on the planet had it. How most white people in Europe had it, right? If you go into all these things, what you say may make sense, but in the back of their mind, there's a certain incredulity to what you're saying, right? And so before you do it, basically you have to use an analogy. Before you can start taking their cities, you have to destroy their army, right? That's one thing that that I forget who it was, but there was there's certain one thing you see when reading military history is that there's certain generals who are obsessed with taking points of victory. They're obsessed with taking cities and taking ports and stuff like that, which don't completely write off. But the best generals care about pocketing the armies. Right? They care about cutting off the supply and destroying army groups. That's what the best generals care the most about. Destroy the army groups, then you can take all the cities and bridges and whatever. So before you can go into the meat of the matter, before you can go into what you really want to convince somebody about, which is that white people don't owe other races anything, before you can get into that and argue against their scapegoat lies, you have to destroy what allows them to believe that in the absence of having a real rigorous basis for belief. Because they say, well, why do you think the slavery of the blacks was particularly bad? They'll prof up some you've heard a million times answers. They'll say, well, it denied them their freedom, it stole their labor, You say, well, actually, they didn't steal their labor any more than railroad workers did. And if you want to talk about freedom, well, practical freedom, they're, white farmers, white free farmers at the time didn't leave their land, hardly ever. They had about as much freedom of movement from their land as, serfs in Russia did and serfs in China did, right? And you can point to all those things. And you could say, well, yes, perhaps, okay, like perhaps you think that Europeans should have bought the black slaves and then freed them. Perhaps that's what you think? Immediately freed them instead of buying them and then using them as slaves. But the problem with that is that they would have been worse had they stayed in Africa. Right? They would have had lower life expectancy, especially as a slave within Africa, which is what they would have been. Okay? And of course, the Atlantic slave trade probably did not increase the number of slaves. The supply of slaves appears to be perfectly inelastic, or at least so much inelastic that that the increase in demand from the Atlantic slave trade didn't increase the supply to any noticeable degree. And moreover, what does it mean to increase the supply of slaves? It means to go to war with more tribes and enslave more people, which, intuitively we can imagine why that would be inelastic. Okay. So you go, and when you talk about these things, when you go into all these things, the more you talk about, it's almost like there's a little meter in their mind, or maybe like a glass tube, and this tube is being filled up with like this red liquid of incredulity. And as you say more and more things, they, and they may agree with you if you just said one thing. If you just said like, oh, the supply of slaves in the Atlantic slave trade was perfectly inelastic, right? Or you said, oh, the freedom that black slaves had was about the same as the freedom that serfs in Russia or China or India at the time had, right? They may agree with that in isolation, right? And wouldn't get suddenly super skeptical, right? This is the term, suddenly skeptical, right? And they may not get skeptical if you say, for example, that the profit on slaves was about the same as the profit on railroad workers. So if you want to talk about expropriated labor, railroad tycoons expropriated the labor of their workers about as much as plantation owners expropriated the labor of their slaves, right? And if you say any of these things in isolation, they may agree with that, or they may not question that. They may go, oh, okay, and it seems like you have a decent source for that, so I'm going to, I'll buy it. I'll buy that. The problem comes when you pile on these claims, the incredulity bar fills up. And when the incredulity bar fills up, they go, look, you're at a point where you're presenting a full-blown counter-narrative. Right? And so for what you're saying to be true, when you're starting to present a full-blown counter-narrative, you're basically telling them that the high tower is full of shit. That not the university that they actually go to, because the university that they actually go to is full of real people who are from time to time full of shit on various topics, okay? So the idea that those people who really exist at the university could be full of shit on everything regarding race, that's not outside the realm of possibility based on the experience that most people have when they go to the university, okay? That's not entirely implausible based on the real people. I'm not talking about the real people. I'm talking about the high tower that exists in the minds of leftists, basically. So the idealized university that doesn't actually exist, like the high tower. Right? So, and what all this does is this basically predetermines how you have to go about doing a comprehensive persuasion of a person. So I think, and this is how it goes. The first thing you have to do before you can talk about anything, because you want to do something comprehensive. You're not throwing out an individual hate fact. You're not. You don't have time for that. You don't have time, to throw out an individual hate fact about, the lynching myth or something like that. To throw out a little hate fact like that, and then wait a week for their incredulity bar to go back down, and throw out another hate fact. Wait another week for their incredulity. No, We got to persuade lots and lots of people. We got to get this through. What you need to do is you need to stop their incredulity bar from rising. And the way that I think you do that, I don't know if that's even possible, but the way I think you do that is you attack the authorities. You attack Magic Science Man. You kill Magic Science Man. So that's the first thing you have to do. You have to attack the universities. Basically, no question. Before you can do anything comprehensive, you have to kill that. The second thing you have to do is then you point out the double standards, right? And the reason you point out the double standards before going into revisionist history and the gap is so that you tell them why you're doing this. Because if you don't tell them why you're doing this, their minds will fill in the blank. It's like, why are you talking about race and IQ and going into all sorts of details about why, blacks are less intelligent than white people for what appear to be genetic reasons? Why are you going into all this effort on that? Okay? And if they don't know that you're being motivated by the anti-white double standards to go into all this stuff, they're going to imagine, oh, you're just a bellicose, aggressive racist. Okay? Now, whether or not you are, in fact, a racist, I don't know. But basically, if you don't tell them that it's about the double standards, they'll think you're bellicose. They'll think you're just, going out, hey, let me tell you how dumb niggers are, or something like that, right? They'll imagine your motivations as something other than what they are, what they are is self-defense. Self-defense in a group intellectual sense. So that's why you have to you have to point out the double standards, and that's why you're doing this. That's why you're talking about this, right? Not because you want to say, look, us white people, white race is best race. I'm tidy whitey man, whatever. I mean, obviously, I'm partial to white people, and all white people are, right? I mean, it's not like some white people will go, oh no, I treat all people of all the races exactly the same. I'm no more comfortable around fellow whites than I am around fellow blacks. Also, I like to stick my nose up my butt until it's a nice golden brown, right? But it's not bellicose. And then there's the gap and history. And I don't know which order to go in there. I know that you have to go after the authorities and then point out the double standards. That's the first two things you have to do. But then I don't know if you want to go into the gap first or history first. I'm leaning towards history first. And the reason I'm leaning towards history first is because it's soft, whereas the gap you're getting into IQ, you're getting into statistics, you're getting into much harder stuff. So I think history is easier because you're not going up against scientists, right? You're going up against historians who are just journalists, right? And if you point that out, if you point that history is basically a form of journalism, how does quote unquote investigative journalism differ from a historian investigating records of something, right? And think about a historian writing about some crime, in the 1930s. Versus an investigative journalist from the New York Times going back into the archives and trying to piece together a crime from the 1930s. Right? They're doing oftentimes historians and journalists are doing literally the exact same thing. Now, typically, what a historian is doing, they're basically doing journalism for events further back in time. Okay, and the hell of it is that if a historian is doing picture painting, not doing deep, into the archives, primary source stuff, but a historian is basically like, okay, I need to talk about the rise of vacuum cleaners during the Roaring '20s. I don't even know if they had vacuum cleaners, but I want to talk about the rise of household conveniences during the 1920s. And I need to get this book done in a month. I don't have time to go into primary sources. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to read newspapers, and they're going to read what contemporary journalists wrote at the time, right? If a historian is under a time constraint, or they're just lazy, they're not going to do primary research. What they're going to do is they're going to parrot the journalists from the 1930s. or they're going to parrot the journalist, or they're going to parrot what some other writer from the 1930s wrote about the time. Okay, they're not going to go, well, let's look into records of sales from Sears and Roebuck, from the Sears and Roebuck catalog as to how many. No, they're just going to look at the written records. So the hell of it is, oftentimes journalists are historians, Freudian slip there. The historians are literally just repeating what journalists at different point in time say. So the distinction between history and journalism, like it's just not real, or it's not significant at all, right? It's just historians tend to operate further in the past, and even that's just a tendency. It's not even a hard rule, right? Journalists will often journalize and about. All they have is a degree in journalism. They don't have a degree in history, so I guess they don't know historical methods. Right? They'll journalize about stuff from the 1980s, and historians will write about trends in the 1990s. Okay, so it's not even a rule that historian. It's just sort of a tendency. It's more of a rule of thumb than it is a hard rule that historians deal in the past and journalists deal in the present, or things near to the present. So anyway, so that's why I think going after history is what you need to do third. And then fourth, you go into the gap. Fourth is when you go into the existence of race and race and IQ. Now, going into the existence of race, before going into race and IQ, for somebody who's hardcore, or somebody who's total high tower, for them, what you benefit from pointing out the existence of race, because what that does is that basically says to them that basically their liberal science bubble is wrong about something. Because I think the existence of race is something that you can basically slam dunk, say is, the race deniers are unambiguously wrong. They don't have anything approaching a plausible sounding argument. Whereas with race and IQ, if you're a real bitter clinger, you can find a few things that can't be proven wrong. Right? You can say, well, we haven't really tested any of this, but maybe, blacks have lower levels of omega GX glycohydrate something than white people do, and if you actually control for this level of glycohydrate, the IQ gap goes away, right? Something's like, yeah, if you control for watermelon and grape drink consumption, the black-white IQ gap goes away. Also, skin color differences go away. So clearly, race differences in skin color are caused by differences in watermelon and grape drink consumption. Right? So they can cling to stupid things, not quite as stupid as watermelon and grape drink consumption, but they can cling to stupid things, right? Whereas with the existence of race, it's much more difficult, and and also just denying the existence of race is it's more viscerally dumb and more viscerally wrong than is the idea of racial equality and intelligence. Because with racial equality and intelligence, what you're dealing with is a more general statistical thing. You're dealing with population averages. And the problem is that every white person has their black friend who has an IQ of 110, and so they say, this guy, he's super smart, super smart. He has an IQ of 110, so he's slightly above average, intelligence for whites. And, and everyone has that, and they have experience with a black person who's kind of smart, and so it's and so it's not viscerally absurd to say that the races are all the same in the brain at a genetic level. Right? It's not viscerally absurd to say that. Now, it's absurd conceptually when you think of it in evolutionary terms. That seems kind of impossible. But in terms of your day-to-day experience, it's not viscerally absurd because we're dealing with overlapping averages, right? We're dealing with bell curve distributions of intelligence. And moreover, intelligence is not like height. Height just sticks out at you, right? If someone was to say that East Asians are just as tall as white people, like people would say that that's viscerally absurd. They would just say that that's ridiculous because they can see the height in every person that they see, right? And the brain will notice the tendency, even though like the white Asian difference in height, there's probably a lot more overlap between whites and Asians in height than there is between whites and blacks in IQ, right? But the thing is, IQ, in order to figure out that someone is dumb, you have to talk to them. And most people you see, you never talk to. So yeah. So it's much more difficult. So that's why breaking down race denial is good, because once you do that, you have actually, at that point, you have done something. You have this is something that's known as the agreement set. Basically, when you say like a series of things that the person agrees with you, it makes it easier for them to agree with you going forward. And so persuading somebody that race doesn't exist is a lot easier than persuading them that 85% of the black-white IQ gap is due to a genetic difference. Right? It's much easier to say blacks and whites exist than it is to say 85% of the black-white IQ gap is due to a genetic difference. So do the easier thing first, right? And that's sort of the order. Okay. So that's that. That's something that I wanted to talk about for a while. And all of this trolling stuff, not just the White Student Union, but in general, I'm sure it has a value, but the value is sort of capped because it's not getting at the problem of the double standard justified by history and the gap, and with which any attempts to break through get pushed back by the authority. Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about here, and I'm going to do a post on this, a real proper post, but at the moment, just sort of thinking out loud, is the thing about Native Americans. And one thing I see on Facebook all over the place is, and it's just annoying as hell, is they'll say that, like, you've heard about the Nazi Holocaust. Well, there's one that's even bigger. It's the Holocaust of the Native Americans. 100 million slaughtered by Europeans. And they put this number out, 100 million. Isn't that convenient? A nice, it just reached the triple digits there. How convenient. A nice round triple digit number. 100 million. So, no. Now, the idea that there would even be 100 million people in the Americas at that time, I mean, like, first off, that would be a population greater than that of Europe. And second off, why don't we see a proportionate amount of structures at that time? Why don't they have more buildings if they had 100 million people? But that aside, one thing that I have found is 4 studies. Okay, first I'll talk about one thing that's more well-founded and another that's more speculative, and that is that I've seen 4 studies on mitochondrial DNA. And with mitochondrial DNA, what you can do with that is you can basically measure the number of lineages. Basically, it measures lineage destruction. So now lineage destruction is usually a good proxy for population decline, because if say 20% of a population of a country just dies from a specific invasion, typically the deaths are localized in an area, and so what you're doing is you're basically exterminating family lines. You're exterminating several family lines, because if you destroy a whole city, you're destroying all the family lines in that city or whatever. Okay. Now, this could be a problem, because let's say, for example, you have 10 families of 10 people. Okay, and then a disease goes through all these families, and 50% of the people die. 50%. Oh, so 50% of the lineages are going to go away. Well, not necessarily, because let's say 5 people from each family die from typhus or smallpox, or whatever it is. Okay, the population was just reduced by half. However, all the lineages remained. So, so when looking at mitochondrial DNA, and there are 4 studies doing this, so this is not it's not just peer review, which I don't put any stock in, but it's replicated. This is a 4 times replicated result that basically shows that there has been like no lineage destruction, like almost none. Now, if there has, and so what that means, first off, is if there was in fact a massive population decline, it was probably due to disease. Because disease, what it will do is it'll ravage through villages and ravage through families and pick off people. Some members of the family will die, some members will survive, but typically the people who die aren't entirely concentrated in a single lineage, right? And so you don't get lineage destruction. So what this means is that if there was indeed a massive population decline, it didn't kill off hardly any lineages. Almost an unnoticeable amount of lineages in 3 of the studies. In the other one, they managed to detect some lineage destruction concurrent with the arrival of Europeans. However, following that, the Native American population, based on the samples that they were using, appears to have increased, basically rebound following that, to being above what it was before the Europeans showed up. So that's interesting. So what this means is that at most, and this is what one of the studies said, was that at most there was about a 50% drop off. And the thing is, the study was actually, what was this? This was Native Europeans experienced a strong population bottleneck coincident with European contact. And what does it say? Okay, it says the mean inferred population sizes suggest a decrease in female effective size of roughly 50% from the pre-decline maximum some 5,000 years ago to the population nadir roughly 500 years before present. So what they're doing in this study, which is, they basically say, oh look, there was a population decline coincident with European contact, but the population had been declining before European contact. And what they do is they compare the population at the very bottom, the very low point following European contact, not to where it was in 1492. Like what they don't do is they don't compare. Okay, what was the population in 1492? What was it in 1550? They don't do that. What they do is they compare what was the population in 1550 compared to what it was in 1000 BC, when it was like way higher. Okay, and so that's pretty dishonest. That's transparently political on that. They're trying to say that what they're doing is it's obvious. He's trying to give the impression that Europeans caused a 50% collapse in the Native American population through their diseases, when actually what their data shows is that there was a population decline concurrent with European arrival that pushed the population down to a point where it was only 50% of what it was 1,000 years prior, or 5,000 years prior. Holy crap! So it's really dishonest. So even this, like, if you just sort of eyeball it, this is like rigorous science here. If you just sort of eyeball it, it looks more like, it's like about 20. Oh, it's a logarithmic scale. Okay, so you can't really eyeball it. Okay. Yeah, probably about like a 20% drop from 1492 to 1550. Probably about a 20%, maybe 30% drop in the Native American population. But the thing is that collapse, that crash in the population number, to the extent it even shows up, and it only shows up in one of the 4 studies, but to the extent that that's even real, like, it was all done before significant colonization of the places. I mean, before, so it wasn't It wasn't Europeans in the manifest destiny traveling across North America killing off Native Americans that coincided with the population decline. It was the mass spread of typhus and smallpox and other diseases from 1492 to maybe around 1600 or something before that. Now, if that's the case, and let's take the high estimate. Let's just forget what he was doing. Let's forget what this study was doing, comparing the nadir not to 1492, but to 5,000 years prior. Let's forget that. Let's just say, fine, European diseases caused a 50% collapse in the Native American population. The problem is the Native American population shot up afterwards, which you would expect. I mean, when Europeans show up, you have more food, you have better farming techniques, right? And even though the Native Americans are kind of like they're kind of like hobos living outside the city. I mean, that's kind of a undignified way to describe them. I mean, you typically want to describe them in a much more romantic setting, but if you just think about what they're doing, yeah, they're kind of like hobos living outside the city. And what are Native Americans like on their plantations? Reservations. What are they like on their reservations today? Well, they're kind of like white trash, right? But they're not white. They're natives. Okay. There were certain people from the Highlands and the Celtic Fringe that settled in the South. Okay. Now, when they're in the Highlands and the Celtic Fringe, they're having their clan wars, and it's all romantic, and they're like painting their faces blue and going do, right? They're doing all their war dances and stuff, kind of like the Native Americans, only with better technology because they're closer to Europe. Okay, then they go to the South, and now they have modern technology. What are they like today? Well, they're hillbillies and white trash, right? Living in trailers, like the Native Americans are. Right? So that's what. But anyway, I digress. So given that the Native American population at most collapsed by 50%, like continent-wide, this then calls into question, well, what was the population of North America? Because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the natives. We're not talking about Mexico. Okay, because Mexico is basically the successor state to the Maya and the Aztec mixed in with New Spain, right? It's a successor state to both New Spain and the Aztec Empire, right? And genetically, it's like a 60-40 mix of the two, like 60% Spanish, 40% Mesoamerican, right? So Mexico has largely made its peace with that, I think. Maybe I'm completely at sea on this, but my perception is that Mexico has basically made its peace as a hybrid of New Spain and the Aztec Empire, as that's what it is. Now, when we're talking about Native Americans and people saying, "Oh, Europeans in the United States don't have any right to control their immigration because of their mass migration into the lands of the Native Americans," right? What that is predicated on is the idea that the Native Americans owned all of this land. Now, problem, what is ownership, right? Let's say I go off into the hills. Well, first off, let's take the most absurd example. Let's say I piss into the ocean. Do I own the ocean? No, nobody would say that. Okay. Let's say I go off into the hills and hunt a few deer in those hills. Do I then own those hills? Most people would say no. Okay. What if me and 5 people lived in some hills and hunted in those hills, and we did this for, 20 generations, for as long as we can remember, and in addition to doing all that, we then come up with myths about, spirits in the hills based on sounds that we heard at night. Oh, these spirits only come at night when it's harder to see, by the way. Right, we came up with a bunch of dumb legends, and we call ourselves the Kennewaukee Hill people, right? You see, that's Native Americans, right? It's basically just a bunch of hobos living in the hills coming up with dumb stories about the hills, right? So do they then own those hills? Well, I mean, if you want to say that they do, well then why doesn't Bob, who like hunted a few deer one weekend, own his hills? Oh, it wasn't there long enough. Well, how long is long enough? I mean, so you get into a population of ownership. And moreover, how much land do they own? And moreover, what land does a hunter-gatherer own versus an agriculturalist? Let's say, okay, a hunter-gatherer, if he's hunting on an area, you can't incur into it as a hunter-gatherer. But can you incur into it as an agriculturalist? Can you come into an area and start farming? And then, like, you basically, when you're farming, you're using your land a lot more than the hunter-gatherer is using his land. And you're claiming a much smaller plot, so then do you justly own that? Are we going with some sort of active use definition? So there is no like objective definition of ownership. Now, if you go into active use definition of ownership, then you get into a problem because then you're basically justifying open borders and there's no limitations on space and population. Because now you have a situation like, well, there's lots of people in India. They would sure like to have all this open space, so let's bring in 600 million people and have them all farming all this land. And, now there's no open space, right? That sucks. Not having open space kind of sucks. So you don't want to go down that road and have like that's the road that active use property goes down. It goes down to everyone like owns land and there's no free space ever. Right, there's no wilderness ever. Wilderness gets destroyed because, well, you don't own it because you're not farming it or something. So that's a problem. So you can't go down that road. But then there's a question: well, did the Native Americans own North America? Well, the first thing we need to ask is what was the population of the Native Americans in North America at the time? And I read somewhere. And this is something that's been quoted quite a bit. Now, I haven't done due diligence as to how accurate this is, but it's something that's widely quoted, and a figure that's commonly quoted is that hunter-gatherers have a population density of 0.1 per square kilometer, or 1 hunter-gatherer for every 10 square kilometers on the Earth. Now, obviously that's going to be different from different areas. The Arctic Circle, it's probably going to be higher than that. Okay. But what I did is I said, okay, well let's just, for the heck of it, let's just take that formula, combine Canada and the United States, the area of that, right, the area of those two countries, add them together, okay? The United States, because it includes Alaska, is actually bigger than Canada, believe it or not. But let's just add those together, and what you get is about 1.85 million if you just use that formula. Now, what you could say is that, well, it would actually be lower than that because a lot of Canada is like a lot of it's just literally in the Arctic Circle, but the part that's not in the Arctic Circle is still really cold, and it's going to have a lower population of hunter-gatherers than 0.1 per kilometer squared. It's like, okay, point taken. However, what about the United States east of the Mississippi? That's probably going to have a hunter-gatherer population more than. So averaged all together, I don't see, it seems plausible to me. 1.85 million, why not? I mean, that seems, or maybe it's 1.84. Well, it would be easy enough for the reader to do, to find the area of Canada, the United States, and how many kilometers square that is, and multiply that by 0.1. So I found that, and I thought, okay, well that's a decent estimate, 1.85 million. It's 2 million is a number that I've seen as kind of a consensus estimate among historians for the population of North America. Some of the earliest censuses on the Native Americans had them, I believe it was around 270,000. 270,000. Okay. Now, the mitochondrial DNA studies that looked at lineage destruction, if we go with this one, which was, we'll call it the O'Fallon study, and this was the one that said a 50% decline. If we just say 50% decline, Well, 270,000 times 2 would be 540,000. So are we saying that there were 540,000 Native Americans in North America in 1492? I look at that and I say, to me, that seems low. I could sit here and puff my chest. That seems low to me, and 1.8 million seems about right to me, but what do I know? I mean, like, do you see? It's like, and moreover, the O'Fallon's numbers, they don't just apply to North American natives; they apply to all Native Americans. So it could have been higher in North America, right? The degree of decline could have been higher in North America, not necessarily to Europeans killing them off, but because I looked at the federal government actually did an estimate on the amount of deaths caused by the wars against the Indians, and I don't see any reason why they would lie about this. I don't see any reason why they would want to understate the number of Indians they killed as opposed to wanting to inflate it. Right? I mean, we could say that, they wanted to understate it so as to assuage their guilt. Or, well, at the time, maybe they wanted to inflate it. Maybe they wanted to say, look how many Indians we killed. Look, we're awesome. I don't know. But they said about 30,000 Native Americans were killed in the Indian Wars versus 19,000 white people. Now, I was surprised about that. I was surprised that they estimated that 19,000 white people were killed in those wars, but then when you think about it, the U.S., a lot of these conflicts were not against U.S. regulars. There was, militia conflicts, just basically citizens with guns versus Native American tribes who had guns as well. The Native Americans were defending, so when you think about all the issues, it's not that surprising that the Native Americans were able to inflict as many losses as they did against a technically superior opponent. But the point of that is that's pretty low, right? You can't really account for much of the loss from like direct action against the Native Americans. Apparently that only accounts for about 30,000. Maybe it's a bit more. But you know what? If it's more, let's say if you go all the way back to the mid 1600s, all the way to the incorporation of Oklahoma, you add all those up. I mean, maybe all told, all over that period, that may add up to 100,000 natives killed from direct action. But the thing is, that was over multiple generations. So it's not like you took a population and then took a 100,000 man chunk out of it, right? You're killing those people over time, and but later generations get replenished. So there's that. But even that, I mean, let's say, okay, well, let's be generous here. Let's say 100,000. Let's say it was 370,000. Let's say there were 270,000 natives in the first census. 100,000 of them were killed by direct action. And you know what? Let's say that the Trail of Tears, starvation from being forced inward into land, causing conflicts between Native American tribes. Let's put that all together, and let's say that it would have been double. Okay, 540,000. And then let's say, but then again there were the Europeans who arrived with their diseases, which actually had the population way back, in the 1500s. Right? Before the Europeans even made contact with most of the Native American tribes, they were being eviscerated by European diseases that spread throughout the continent. Okay, so now we're at about 1 million. Now we're at 1.08 million people if we do all that, And of course, this is very fuzzy math, but I feel like I'm making very generous assumptions here, and it all comes to numbers lower than 2 million, basically. And you may go, well, Ryan, you're engaged in motivated reasoning because you're a racist, white supremacist bigot or something like that. But am I? I don't feel that I am, but then again, a white racist, white supremacist bigot would say that, wouldn't he? Okay, so there's that regarding the population. But then there's also things when looking through this, for example, I saw something like, and this is on Wikipedia, and this is repeated all the time, which is that they say that Tenochtitlan, at its peak, had a population of 200,000 people. And I did this, and I found that it would have. Okay. Do you consider? And I did a Facebook post here. Maybe I should find the Facebook post. Okay, here it is. So, Tenochtitlan had Tenochtitlan had an area of 5.2 square miles. And what's great about Tenochtitlan, unlike Rome, when people are talking about like trying to reconstruct the population of ancient Rome, they have to deal with shifting definitions as to what Rome meant. Was it past this wall? Was it past the lateral wall, the atrial wall, or whatever? Like all the different walls that Rome had, there's all sorts of subjectivity as to what constituted Rome. Whereas with Tenochtitlan, it's very nice because Tenochtitlan was literally bound as like an island in the middle of a lake. I forget the name of the lake, but it was an island in the middle of the lake, so we know like very clearly the footprint of the city, and it was 5.2 miles squared. And the historic consensus is that in that 5.2 square miles, there was a city that had a population of 200,000. Now that comes up to a population density of 38,461 per square mile. Okay. Now, Boston has a population density of 13,340 per square mile. Mexico City has a population density of 15,000 per square mile. So Tenochtitlan was more than twice as dense as Mexico City. New York City, has a population density of 27,858 per square mile. And Manhattan itself, Manhattan, of course, has a population density of 71,672. Now, Manhattan, that's like skyscrapers. That's like Empire State Building. That's where the World Trade Centers were. That's people on top of people on top of people on top of people. Tenochtitlan had no residential two-story buildings. All residential buildings were single-story. Okay. So, right. And so I'm thinking, well, where did the 200,000 number come from? And I just don't see where it came from. I don't see how they're getting. I mean, that would be a higher population density than the Gaza Strip, which we are told is an anthill. I just don't. With no two-story buildings and people living there I just don't see it. I just don't see how they're doing it. And moreover, they have to have the food to come in from that area. And you could say, well, there was contemporary cities in Europe that were that big. Yes, Europe had more advanced agricultural techniques and could transport food from longer distances. Okay, so yes, Europe had bigger cities, but anyway, this just seems silly. The population density that historians are trying to say about Tenochtitlan. And there's also now I think the myth has kind of died, but I'm still seeing people going around talking about the spreading of smallpox. That people in the U.S. would actually put smallpox into blankets and then sell the blankets to the Native Americans. The problem with that is that they would have to do it pretty quick because smallpox dies outside of the body within 24 hours. So they would have to get people who are already infected with smallpox, see the natives coming and then rub the blanket on the person with smallpox. Hopefully they don't get it, right? And then give it to the natives, right? That's one thing that they would have to do after, and this of course is way after the initial wave following the arrival of Columbus and the spreading of smallpox and typhus throughout the entire continent. So it would be after that, after the natives have developed some resistance to it, as it is, and it would involve the people believing in germ theory, which I forget when the siege of Fort Pitt was, perhaps the Siege of Fort Pitt was after germ theory was accepted in academia. But then again, just because germ theory was accepted in academia at the time doesn't mean it was accepted amongst the proles at the time. It doesn't mean that they believed in germ theory or understood the concept of germs, right? So yeah, it just seems right, and so when you actually break it down like that, that's another absurdity. So regarding the Native Americans, there's all these little there's two little absurdities there. One is the smallpox. One is is the population density of Tenochtitlan. So, and like the idea that Europeans were these ridiculous bigots that were intent on mass murder. I mean, certainly that doesn't jibe with how Europeans today are like. Certainly, white people in the U.S., as bad as you think the Republican Party is or whatever, I mean, they're not calling for mass murder or even secretly plotting it in the background or something. Like, certainly, but in the past, but in the far past, in the foggy corners of the far past, people were so radically different that there are today. It's plausible sounding to think that there were these sorts of conspiracies back then to engage in this mass murder. Now, when dealing in sort of like the moral battle with people saying that, Europeans came in and took their land or whatever, first off, the idea that they own the land is... Let me put this in perspective. There are probably... based on what I have said today, and I'm going to do a proper article that's more usable. This podcast is not usable out and talking to people. But, at most 2 million people. 2 million people in North America. There's several reasons as to why you should think that it's even lower than 2 million. But never mind. Let's just say 2 million. Okay? The population of Montana is 1 million. All right? So... And Montana is empty. Montana is damn empty. So basically what we're dealing with, if there were 2 million people in the United States, we're dealing with basically the population of Montana, and I think if you can take the population of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, I think Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota would be it. Or maybe you have to add Wyoming or something. Maybe Montana, Wyoming, plus a little change or something. But take that population, which is empty. I mean, when you go across Montana, it is empty. Now, when you drive across Montana, you're driving across the highway, okay? And the highway is more developed than off the highway. Most of the United States is off the highway, okay? So when you drive across the highway and you feel like you're driving across like Montana or South Dakota or something and you feel like you're on the frickin' moon, well, guess what? That's actually a more dense screenshot of that area than it is further off the highway. Because you go across the highway in South Dakota, it's like, oh look, you see a little gas station. Yeah, you get miles off the highway, start driving over there. There aren't gas stations every 20 miles. Okay, every 20 miles, there's nothing. And then another 20 miles, nothing. Okay? And so just think about how empty, Montana and South Dakota, North Dakota is in general. Okay. But then basically multiply that emptiness times, 50 or something. Well, actually, yeah, about 50. There's 50 states. Alaska's bigger, but the other states are generally smaller. So, yeah, if you multiply that by 50, that's a rough mental image of how... Basically, take however dense Montana is as you're driving down the middle of nowhere in Montana and how spread out that is. And spread that out 50 times more. That's about how dispersed the Americas were when the Europeans first showed up. And that's why they said it was a wilderness. Because it was a wilderness. It was a goddamn wilderness when they showed up. And it took them, and most of the settlers, when they landed, it took them several days to meet with the natives. You see these paintings of these people landing, and they show the ship, and they're getting off the ship, and they come and meet the natives or whatever. Like, that's what happened in the paintings. Okay, but in North America, maybe that happened more down in Central America where it was more densely populated. I don't know. But I know that in North America, the settlers would settle, build a little camp, and then and then it would take like a week before the natives who as hunter gatherers they travel around a certain area and they would get to an area and they would see the Europeans. Right, it would take days or maybe even a month to come into contact with them. And that's how empty it was. So that's just something to consider when people sort of have an imagining that, oh, you're taking their land. It's like, true, there is no objective criteria of what constitutes land ownership, but take the population density of Montana and then multiply that times, well, actually more like multiply that times 25. Right? That's probably more accurate. Take the population density of Montana and then spread that out 25 times. The idea, like, how could they own that much land? That seems a bit ridiculous, sort of at an intuitive level. Now, I'm obviously a big fan of self-determination. And some people may say, oh, well, you're just a big fan of self-determination because you're a white nationalist. Well, no, actually, before I was one, right, back when I was, hardcore libertarian anarcho-capitalist, I was a huge proponent of self-determination, right, and separatism and people going their own way. Okay, so that is a genuine thing that predates any kind of racial identity. Now, another moral argument that I'm sort of looking into is that self-determination, our conception, like you have all these people today. You have the Native Americans saying how Europeans were so bad by taking away their land, right? Which we just talked about, how that's kind of dubious. But taking away their land, and then how Europeans denied their self-determination. The problem, though, is that if you look at the history of Native Americans, they're constantly attacking each other and denying other tribes self-determination, right? Now, I'm not making a dumb argument, like what some people will do, and this is what dumb conservatives will do. Is they say, well, Native Americans were violent against each other, so that justifies us being violent against them. Right, that's a dumb argument, okay? But what I'm saying is that this whole concept, the argument that they're using, which is the right to self-determination, this was an argument that they got from the Europeans, okay? Nobody was arguing from self-determination prior to the idea of self-determination being spread out from Europe, okay? When Europe went into Africa, the Africans weren't going, hey, I have a right to determine my own nation and my own people deserve a state of their own, right? Nobody was doing that. I mean, when the Zulu were going in and hacking apart whoever they were, the Khoisan or the Bantu or whatever, like they weren't going. The Khoisan weren't going, hey, we have a right to self-determination. This is our land. Like Zulus didn't fucking care, right? And when the Native Americans were the big tribes were swallowing the smaller ones, they didn't care. They didn't have any conception of self-determination. Right. Another thing that's kind of funny. So basically, these Native Americans, like it's sort of absurd. They're using an argument against Europeans, which is that Europeans are violating or did violate their self-determination many moons ago. They're using that argument against Europeans when they wouldn't even have that argument in their intellectual arsenal if it were not for Europeans. Okay, there's a little bit of an absurdity there. But another thing to look at is one thing that Native Americans will do, or not Native Americans, although I know one who does do this, but typically liberal whites will talk about, the Confederate States of America wanting to leave the Union. Okay. And how that was quashed. Now, some of the uber assholes, the uber asshole types, they'll say, well, the Confederate States of America, they were traitors to the Union and they needed to be brought back in, blah, 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 blah. And then to which I ask, well, why aren't Native Americans traitors to the Union, by not wanting to be in it? Why aren't they, but now one thing you could say is that they made an agreement or something, but but the point was that the people of the Confederate States of America didn't believe that they believed that the agreement was that they could leave, right? So, and basically it goes like this. This is an oversimplification, but basically you had the states coming into the Union, entering into an agreement, and at the beginning they thought the agreement was that they could leave whenever they wanted, and then when the government was doing things that some of the states didn't like, some of the states, which became the Confederacy, said, "All right, we have a right to leave the Union," and then the Union went back on their treaty, a treaty known as the Constitution. They went back on that treaty and went after. So you can sort of see the parallels here. Right now, some just, bonehead, meathead assholes will just say, well, they're traitors to the Union, unionism, sacred union, right? But the better argument would be that, well, the Confederate States of America had black slaves. They had slaves. So they don't have a right to separate from the Union. Which, in a vacuum, I could sort of see. But the hell of it is that the Union wasn't telling them, oh, hey, free your slaves and then we'll let you go. I mean, they didn't make that argument. In fact, going in, they said, we have no intention to end slavery, right? The North didn't even bring that up as something that would be a requirement, right? They went in to preserve the Union, and Lincoln actually said at the beginning, preserve the Union. Now, he changed his mind at the end, after the war, but he stated publicly that he was going in to preserve the Union. So even if Lincoln ultimately, like in the back of had a master plan to ultimately end slavery, most of the people in the North did not, right? And so basically the motivating energy of the Lincoln government was to preserve the Union, even if you want to say that in Lincoln's own personal psychology he was planning to ultimately free the slaves. The point is the North was just doing it to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But even then, Native American tribes held slaves. That's an important point to make. So people will say, well, the Confederate States of America is disqualified as a separatist movement because they had slaves. Well, Native Americans had slaves not in the per capita proportion that whites in the Confederate States of America did, but the point is they had the Native Americans had slaves about as much as they could, right? If they could get slaves, they did get slaves. They didn't have any qualms about slaves. They didn't go, hey, you don't have a right to own another human being, right? Remember, like that idea, you don't have the right to own another human being, that's one of these European ideas, okay? That didn't exist in Africa, which was doing all the slavery. That didn't exist in the Islamic world. That was getting slaves, i.e. Slavs, from Eastern Europe all the time, right? That didn't exist in China, which still had serfdom, which was basically functionally slavery, okay? That didn't exist, right? So this idea, right? So the Native Americans, they had slaves as well, as much as they possibly could. Now, is their national identity disqualified because they held slaves? Let me ask you another question. Is Brazil's national identity disqualified because they had slaves? Right? Because Brazil not only had more slaves than the former Confederate States of America, but they had more slaves per capita than the former Confederate States of America. So does Brazil's independence from either Portugal or from the United States, is that disqualified because they had slaves? Or should we prevent them from being an independent country because they may, in the future, attempt to reinstitute slavery or some dumb shit like it's just bizarre. But I'm going off on a tangent here. Another thing to do with the argument now regarding the Native Americans, sort of a moral argument when people try to bring that up, is that, well, I mean, you're concerned about genocide in the Americas, okay? Are you concerned about the genocide that the Siberians did? Right? And the Siberians are, of course, what we call the Native Americans today. But these were the people that crossed the land bridge. They were the third big group that arrived in the Americas. Okay, they arrived after the early Europeans who aren't there today. Right? There were some Europeans, and there's evidence of Europeans arriving in basically modern-day Quebec there's artifacts and evidence, and there's stones that actually come from France and only exist in France. So there's pretty certain that these were European people, but where are they now? Also, there's no admixture. There's no detectable admixture within Native Americans of Europeans from that time period. Okay, so what happened to them? Well, it's possible they all starved to death. Okay, that's a possibility. There's also a possibility that they were exterminated. Oh, that's one thing I would want to ask to anybody who's listening to this far. Does anybody listening to this far know of when the European, like, is there any data on, like, when, or idea of when the Europeans that arrived in the Americas, when they went away? Because if basically the disappearance of these Europeans coincided with the arrival of the Siberians, that's evidence of an extermination. More evidence of a kind of extermination is the Australoids. There's Australoid genetic admixture amongst the natives in the Amazon, in like the middle of Brazil, and also further north into like Venezuela, Colombia, and into like all the smaller Latin American jungle states. It kind of peters out once you get up into Mexico, though. So, and Australoids. Australoids, these are like Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guineans. Sometimes, colloquially, they're called Melanesians. Yeah, so they basically managed to get all the way across the Pacific and populate a large area. And moreover, remnants like Australoid type people were found at the very southern tip of Baja California. They were called the Paracues. Baja California, the state of California, and then there's like a little strip that goes way down, and it's like a little strip jutting out into the ocean, and it just goes south, parallel along the Mexican coast. That's Baja California, and at the very southern tip of that were a population of Melanesian, Australian Aborigine, New Guinean type people, and they were called the Paracues. There's another pocket of them down at the Strait of Magellan, basically the very southern tip of South America. Just off the southern tip of South America is an island, and the island is called Tierra del Fuego. And on that island, that's where the Fuegians lived, and these were Melanesian, Papua New Guinean type peoples. So what we have is basically basically abo, Australoid admixture within Native Americans in Brazil, okay, in basically northern Brazil, and we see little pockets of them, little remnants of them on the island of Tierra del Fuego, and at the very tip of Baja California. Basically, let me put it this way: if they were being systematically massacred and sometimes bred with and pushed out of the continent down to like the absolute fringes, this is kind of what you would expect to see, is it not? Right? You would expect to see them basically existing in like little pockets that the Siberians didn't get to, which is the island of Tierra del Fuego and a very little southern tip of Baja California, and the remaining evidence of their existence is in the admixture, and the admixture only in a few certain areas. So now you could say that, well, it wasn't necessarily mass murder. It could have been, inbreeding. It could have just been breeding with them. But the hell of that is like, well, okay, there's a lot of Europeans in the United States that have, they're like 1/64th Cherokee or something. Oh, look, there was no mass killings. It was all just peaceful breeding with them, right? Okay, see how that evidence works. So, like you could say the fact that there's like Australoid admixture amongst Native Americans, like Siberians. They're mostly Siberian with some Australoid admixture in them. In the Amazon, you could say, the fact that there's admixture is just evidence that they bred. Is it? Maybe. Or it's evidence that they were massacring them and they raped a few of the women. Maybe it's that, and they kept the women around as breeding stock. And killed all the men. That's a possibility. But there's also a possibility that it was a mixture of both, right? And a mixture of both, kind of like how the Europeans interacted with the natives. Sometimes, as they were moving westward, sometimes they would kill the Native Americans, sometimes they'd trade, sometimes they'd breed with them. Okay, and as the Native American, I'm going to use proper terms. That as the Siberians were moving further south down into South America, why would there be admixture with the Australoids, and why aren't the Australoids there? Well, sometimes they bred with them, sometimes they traded with them, sometimes they killed them, but ultimately it was the Siberian wave that pushed all the way down and pushed them to the brink. Okay, so now these Siberian peoples, now they're crying about Europeans doing to them what they did to the Australoids. Now, the reason we know very well what happened to the Siberians, what the Europeans did to the Siberians, is because Europeans have good technology and they have good records of things. So, and because Europeans have good technology and good records of things, there's records of their quote unquote bad deeds. But with the Siberians, right, they don't have good records of things. In fact, there's two funny instances. One of which is I forget if it's a peach tree or an apricot tree, but basically there is a tree, a fruit that is native to Turkey or Anatolia, and there were some European explorers, and some of these seeds had gotten into North America, and there were these trees growing in North America. And this was like 1800 or something. So the seeds probably arrived like in the 1600s and spread around. So by 1800 there were a few peach trees in a few regions. And they met up with this Native American tribe, and this Native American tribe, they had a whole myth about how the peach tree came about and how one of their gods gave them the gift of the peach tree and all this stuff. So the idea that these Native American myths are like thousands of years old or accurately reflect the true saga of their people is bullshit. They have myths about where horses came from, right? They don't say, oh yeah, the horses came from the Spanish. Right? They don't say that. They say the horses came from the horse god, Shamalama-ding-dong or something, right? They have a dumb myth about where the horses came from, which is obviously not true. Okay, so and so that's why there's like clear evidence of Europeans sometimes massacring natives, sometimes trading with them, sometimes breeding with them. But what the natives did to the Australoids, you don't have that same kind of evidence because the Siberians were so technologically backwards compared to what the Europeans were. Well, I shouldn't say that. They weren't technologically backwards for their time. And in fact, the Aztec and the Inca Empire weren't technologically backwards compared to, contemporary India or something, right? They were only technologically backwards compared to Europe. Okay, so that's unfair. That was unfair of me to say. They were not technologically backwards. They were actually basically on par. So yeah. So that's just what I wanted to say. This is a podcast that I'm doing. It's like past 4 a.m. here. The podcast is running on 2 hours before editing. I need to get to bed because I'm getting really tired. I'm starting to drift off here. And so that is New Europe Radio Today, kind of a rambly podcast for the second one of this little series here. Apologies about that, but I wanted to get one out. My schedule is Friday. I'm going to do it every Friday. Hopefully there was enough interesting stuff here. Hopefully I didn't loop. When I'm tired, I loop. When I'm tired, I loop and I repeat things when I'm tired. But hopefully, like, this wasn't too rambly. It wasn't too erratic, too spastic, and you were able to enjoy some things or able to listen to things, or who knows, maybe you just enjoy hearing my voice or something. Right? But that's the end of this haphazard, last-minute Thanksgiving edition of New Europe Radio, and hopefully the song of life is not your death.